agriculture program, nobody would have ever thought that you could do high-end tourism and get the kind of revenue that you get the kinds of incomes that you get women now running the subject in Rwanda, ensuring that it is no longer a lonely business, and hopefully that there will be more of you later, but also that it is a sector that is generating income. More importantly, 30,000 livelihoods out of this is what we want to do and what we should be looking for. So I think if there's one thing we take away from today is, first of all, it is around all of us. The magnitude of the problem is big, and we can all do something about it. It is happening in our backyards. These are pictures of Mozambique after the flood. This is what will happen if we were not doing something differently. But this is what is also happening and making us more vulnerable to, again, yet another cyclone and yet another natural disaster. And it's not just happening to the humans, it's now happening to the animals, and it's of course happening to our ocean life. All of this is a collective. We can't do one, and I think, John, you're the one who said it, you can't do one without the other. It can be, and true, you can't have the tail wagging the dog. It will always start with the economics. It will always be somebody who has a budget to balance and who can pay for it. But I think that what Africa needs to begin to realize is that actually we can use biodiversity, we can use conservation to pay for a lot more. So this is not the case where the Minister of the Environment needs to go and beg the Minister of Finance. It is the case where the Minister of Finance has to go to the Minister of Environment and say, how much more revenue am I going to get from you this year because you have become my primary revenue source, because we are doing things right. Of course, the impact of biodiversity on our continent is particularly acute, not because a lot more is happening, but because there is a lot less protection for what we are doing, and I think that that's a little bit what John was also saying. 14% of the continent's land, 2.6% of its seas are classified as protected areas, but we do not have the capacity to protect them in the way in which we would like. We need more of you young women to go into schools and come out and be able to do those jobs. It is a whole huge job creation industry, and we must look at it like that. It is true today that we're all talking about getting into the digital space, but actually the combination of the digital space and nature conservation is something that we need to start talking about and looking at and telling our youth on the continent they can do something by going into that. What is the scale of the ambition? We need to cut 30 gigatons a year, and I don't know how many people understand what that means, but it's 3 times the size of Colorado, I read from the internet, in terms of carbon emissions by 2030, to be able to protect our wetlands, to be able to protect our wildlife, to be able to ensure that our sea material stays, and that we ourselves as humans, because at the end of the day it is also about us. 1,000 lives were lost in the Vera corridor with the cyclone Endai, and a number of lives are being lost in Brazil. So at the end of the day it does come back to us as humans. Going forward, when you look at it, there's already 7 billion of us on the continent. Today we will be 9.7 by 2050. We need to continue feeding this planet. We need to continue feeding nature. We need to continue feeding the rest of the environment, and we need to grow. And the question is, can we do all that and still promise that we will be able to reduce carbon emission? And the answer is yes. But it's going to require a lot of resolute policy direction. Our leaders, but more importantly, our youth need to come on this fight and need to understand why decisions are going to be made in the direction in which they're going to be made. The first and the most important, it's almost impossible, anybody who knows me, that I don't talk about energy, and energy happens to be in this space one of the most important, because as a continent, we cannot grow if we do not have energy. We cannot grow, we cannot transform, we can't even protect nature if we do not have the kind of energy that we need. So the question is, what kind of energy? And for a very long time, there has always been this debate where we should do coal, because if you do coal, coal is cheaper. And I think that that debate has persisted for a while. But we now know, and this was the sort of, when 10 years ago, when you wanted to be an industrial country, when you wanted to show that you were growing, then you wanted your capitals and your surrounding urban areas to look like this. Because the emissions coming out of the energy plant showed that actually you were pumping energy and the country was growing, and when you drove through a countryside that looked like this, you felt that yes, there's growth happening here, something interesting is happening. We no longer want this. We no longer want economic transformation to look like this. And we know that we no longer need for it to look like this, because the cost of energy is dropping. And yes, we will all say, the cost of energy is dropping, the cost of renewable energy. And I like these two pictures because both of them look very almost Romanesque now, particularly the evening one. And you have the sort of pipes coming out, and we've worked to make sure that, as you burn fossil fuels, you can make them cleaner. That's why the pipes are smaller now, because there's still new standards for smaller pipes that ensure that emissions are smaller and better. So even in the fossil fuel world, we are moving towards ensuring that, there is less emission that is coming out, and a lot of the companies are going in that direction. But we can do better, and we can have countrysides that are also generating jobs, that are transforming economies, but that are not emitting anything. And there you have, wind plants. You can see this in Mauritania, you can see it now in Cape Verde, and many other countries on the continent. Of course, the solar plants are all over in South Africa, in Zambia, in Senegal. More and more countries are doing solar and clean energy and renewable energy. And I think this is where the conversation then begins. Once you start doing clean energy, the question on competitiveness, can you become more competitive? And the answer is yes. So again, we don't need somebody to pay us to move to clean. By definition, if you move to clean, you also become more competitive, so you can create more jobs, so your economy gets better. And I think this is the narrative that at the Economic Commission for Africa we are trying to move towards. It's conservation, improvements in managing our environment are actually cost-effective, deliver better prosperity, and on the health side, of course, are cheaper, because we know today that air pollution is one of the largest killers across the world, and actually in Africa even more. It's our women who are burning wood, it's pollution from fossil fuel factories, and we need to take that away. If we take that away, we can actually reinvest in more nature conservancy. So I think making those synergies and ensuring, and this is why we need more people to do this work, that actually people understand that it's not an either or, it is actually let's go and let's do it and do it well. Marine life. And this is, I didn't know this until I started preparing this talk. Normally now we say you need to build embankments, because when you have cyclones and you have sort of tsunamis coming in, if you put a wall up, then you can protect it. But actually, all you need to do is put more corals and put more seashells into the coastal areas, and they multiply themselves. And the economic cost of building a wall is about $20,000 per square foot of the wall, $1,200 for the shells. So again, if you just look at it, and then I dive, so most of us will then go and dive, because you will rebuild reefs and you will make it a tourist attraction. So I think one of the things that we want to do in the continent is make this conversation no longer a conversation about what we are suffering from, what has been sort of put upon us, and we're a continent where a lot has been put upon us, but there's a few things that we can actually take control of. And I think some of it is within our reach, but we need, and this is where ALU becomes an important part of the equation, and institutions like ours, we need more information out there. We need our leaders, we need our policymakers, not just to have an environmental department, but to know what that environmental department needs to do, and in what time frame it needs to be done by. The whales picture in Djibouti, I didn't know that you can do whale watching in Djibouti and create jobs and develop a whole tourism industry. But actually one of the things that has happened is because not many people knew, there has been this natural conservation of Djibouti's marine life. Now that we begin to know, the question is, how do you do policy? How do we ensure that we can protect it? So in part of on part of the continent, we're going to restore. We're going to need to restore. In Cameroon, we need to build more forest cover. In Rwanda, we are managing and we're improving. And in other parts of the continent, we're going to protect. And I think each one of us, when we leave here today with those three words, is where can I restore? Where do I need to manage? And where can I protect? And in doing that, how can I add the resources and make more financial resources available. Again, the message being, as you restore, as you manage, as you protect, you're building prosperity for the continent. You're building prosperity for the entire planet. Because the beautiful thing, fortunately or unfortunately, about conservation is that when you conserve in one part of the world, you're not only helping that part of the world, you are actually helping the global community. So it is community neutral in terms of the contribution. If you're reducing carbon emissions in Brazil, it will help somebody in Zimbabwe, and if you're reducing carbon emissions in Algeria, it will help somebody in Chile. So we are hoping, as we all go to Chile at the end of the year, that this global conversation, unfortunately we are living now in a period where there is a lot of receding of the euphoria of Paris and COP21, and we see many of our member states going backwards on their commitments, beginning with Brazil and a few others, that we can have this conversation that says it is a global good and we can do it as a collective. I think you have to play with the computer again. The next part that I wanted to talk about was agriculture. As we stand on the continent, agriculture is, of course, one of our most, I would say, precious assets. And that combination of agriculture, nature, our wildlife, has become, I think, a conversation that we're having more and more now. We are now at the Economic Commission for Africa working on this tension between rapid urbanization, sprawling cities that are getting into protected wildlife areas. How do you do that? And as you said, it's not about, do I have to choose between the people and our wildlife? It's how can you manage both, and what is the right balance, and how do we make that conversation a conversation about prosperity for all, as opposed to a conversation around one person is driving out the other, or one community is driving out the other. Now, I said that we needed 30 gigatons of excess carbon to be taken out of the atmosphere for us to be able to meet the challenge of 2030. The agriculture and forestry sector is one area where we could actually, by doing more, do a lot of reduction. And essentially, if you look at the work that we're doing, and you've talked about it already here, by protecting our forest, by protecting the wetlands, and by protecting the grasslands, you can already begin to reduce almost 3,000 of that number. Again, here, this is an area where Africa can do more, because we don't need a lot of resources to protect. We don't need a lot of resources to plant more trees. I think many of you would have seen what just happened recently in Ethiopia, with the Prime Minister leading this charge to plant 350 million trees and break the world record. Imagine if all of the African continent did something similar, how much more reduction we would be putting in place, and the cost of that exercise versus the benefits 10 years down the road are quite important and quite consequential. We are now working with the government of Ethiopia to see what is the sustainability. And around that, we are looking at clean cooking stoves. So now not only are we looking at how you plant trees, but we're saying, let's get the women into better healthy conditions. And by planting trees and getting cooking stoves, we're creating new jobs. And it creates this virtuous ecosystem that, again, for Africa is no longer about somebody did it to me, what can I do differently? But it's about I can actually take charge of this, do it myself, and deliver the prosperity that we need. This is particularly important, and I go back to this prosperity part and the revenue, because I don't think today we can actually launch a campaign that does not deliver on the other end of it prosperity for somebody, that does not deliver, particularly on the continent where our GDP per capita is still low. We don't have that many countries on the continent with GDP per capita above 10,000. I think we have only 4 or 5 of them, and they're dropping because most of them are commodity-rich countries. Prices of commodities are dropping as well. But we have an incredibly rich wildlife conservation, marine coastal system, where if we fell back to that and decided that we wanted to develop that, our natural resource wealth, and the World Bank, the IMF, and ourselves are all recalculating Africa's GDP and saying, what if and what would it be if we added that? We would be able to put more in. Now, what is the cost of changing? What is the cost of changing this whole conversation? We have estimated it collectively in the global community at about $4 trillion a year until 2030. The number seems astounding when you look at it like that and say, for us to be able to ensure that we conserve nature, we protect the climate, we need $4 trillion. But we're already spending about $2 trillion of that. And there's an additional $2 trillion that we can create through innovative financing. I won't give you all the examples. I'll give you one, which is Seychelles. Seychelles was in debt, and I'm sure most of you have heard about the Seychelles Bond. Seychelles was a country in a lot of debt, and Seychelles decided, rather than sort of pay back my debt, I will decide to give back to the global community by protecting the coastal boundaries of Seychelles. So essentially, the Seychelles worked with the international community to create what is the Seychelles Blue Bond. And within, essentially, the Seychelles Blue Bond was supposed to pay back within 10 years. It is already paying back and paying back a lot more and much faster. So some of what we are trying to do at the Economic Commission for Africa with other members of the international community is to say, why can't we do more of this kinds of innovative financing that say, let's go into countries and provide the resources that price forward the cost of conservation, that price forward the cost of building an industry that will be not only an industry that benefits the country, but benefits the globe at large. It starts with you, it starts with your internal markets. Of course, we are in Rwanda, we see what is happening this weekend with the naming of gorillas, the number of jobs, but the revenue that it is creating. This is just giving you the ecological footprint. Taking action together. Again, we cannot do this alone. No one of us can do this alone because the scale of the ambition is quite big, but it is doable. The United Nations, in the next few 16 months, as Paul said, we have a number of actions. We have the climate action with UNGA. ACA, we are coming up with what we are calling an SDG 7 bond, which is to move countries to sustainability, working with a lot of financiers that are now going to come behind us and help us with national determined contributions, finance renewable energy in many countries. And it's amazing how quickly you begin to see the numbers and the financing deliver, and new jobs come behind it when you do it well. So stay tuned. We're hoping that we will be able to launch that in September, but actually not just launch it, but deliver some renewable energy projects for the continent sooner. And then, of course, we have 2020 Beijing. We have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. We talk a lot about manufacturing. Today on the continent, services are delivering the jobs. Services are delivering the prosperity for the continent. Conservation is a service sector, and I think we need to do more talking about conservation. Again, ALU is doing a fantastic job of doing that, but collectively we need to get more of our youth into this business because it is a $4 trillion business and we need to be part of it. Key messages: it is not an either or. We can develop and we can conserve. Actually, we must conserve to develop today. I think that is the message. Secondly, it is owned by all. It must be driven by all. Africa cannot do it alone. The world cannot do it alone, and that is why we need a global multilateral platform to come together to give us these answers. The conservation agenda in Africa must and will always remain a jobs agenda, because we have a youth that needs those jobs, and we have shown that this jobs agenda, the conservation agenda, is an agenda that necessarily delivers prosperity. Thank you very much for listening.
Good afternoon, everyone. So that isn't a hard act to follow at all. So I just want to introduce myself. My name is Bridget Fury, and I'm very privileged today to represent Oppenheimer Generations and the Oppenheimer family. So I would really just like to thank all three of the participants, and particularly Vera, for that really inspiring address and the positivity that you bring to the ability for us to take action and to do things. I didn't know Jennifer, but from what I do know about her, and certainly what Fred said, two things stood out particularly for me. I think probably Fred choreographed this, but we really do feel a bit like we had a day of women today. So apologies to John for his very valuable contribution to the Afternoon of Women, but I think what's really inspiring to me as a woman, and as I think I can still claim to be a young woman, is just the extraordinary talent and inspiring current and new leaders that we are growing. And that's not to discourage the men, because we need you too. And the second is, I guess, both just in terms of new approaches, but more importantly, around action and around taking new approaches in a really creative way to a problem that is both a problem but an enormous opportunity. And I think what Jennifer would be hugely encouraged by is the solutions thinking, and rather than seeing this as a challenge and really turning it around, seeing it as an asset and an opportunity for Africa, and in particular, Vera, the way you described us as compared to some other continents. We have all these extraordinary assets, and we are able, with collective, creative and new approaches, to be able to set the agenda for the next generation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bridget. I'd like to say we scripted the Afternoon of Women, but I'm not so sure we quite intended it. But I'm very glad that it has turned out that way. So it's time to go into the final session of the talent section of this conference. But it is the first of 2 interactive sessions that we will have during BCC 2019. For this one, we invite you to go back to school with us. For some of you, it's been a while since you've been to school, so it's time to do so. And we invite you to do so at our campus, just a short stroll away from here. As you can see, these are the back-to-school sessions that we have. I understand that there's been a glitch with the app, so many of you have not been able to sign up, but that's fine because we will have ushers at Kigali Heights to take you to your respective sessions. So we'll have 1 time slot for each one, paying for habitat for elephants, from cattle ranching to wildlife ranching in Kenya, building high-performing conservation organizations, enhancing the productivity of beekeepers, biodiversity-positive infrastructure development, Africanizing conservation leadership, and bauxite and chimpanzees. For our French speakers, we will have French translation in the building high-performing conservation organizations in the Mali room. So right after we're done with these announcements, please just head out the doors and there will be ushers ready to take you downstairs. Now, a couple of things to note. We've also extended the deadline for signing up for Monday night dinners because of the glitch in the app that we mentioned. We'll most likely have a video up for you tomorrow because we've noticed that many people have not logged into the app, so it's proving a little difficult for you to sign in. So we'll have a video to show you how to do it tomorrow. Please do look at the app for the different announcements. One of the announcements that is on there, which we realize many of you may not have seen, is that the buses to your hotels, to our partner hotels, will leave from Kigali Heights School, not from the conference center. And the last thing is all Conservation MBA students and alumni, please step outside to meet with George and Pratum. And with that, let's go to school.